Chapter 1. Savannah, Georgia, 1968. I am Poppy Wainwright. I am 13 years of age. Some 2 years ago, by way of a dusty Greyhound bus, I came to reside on 22 South Digby Street in Savannah, Georgia. All my kin come from Mountain Home, Arkansas, but I was brought here to Savannah to reside with my Aunt Sookie shortly after my Grandma Laney kicked the bucket. Sook ain't my proper aunt. She's my late grandma's sister. After Grandma Laney died of a weak heart, the officials of Mountain Home started shuffling me around like a deck of playing cards, determining who'd take possession of me. For reasons unclear, Sookie raised her hand and staked her claim. I reckon she drew the short stick. My Grandma Laney and Aunt Sookie shared no sisterly affection, and I don't suppose God could have created two more opposite creatures. Any love the sisters might have ever felt was buried beneath quilts of grievances. Hurtful, poisonous words kept flesh wounds infected, and neither of the two stubborn women had a hankering to reach a forgiving hand across the divide. My late grandma had long warned me that her older sister, Sook, was a blasphemous heathen with a wicked tongue. Sook said my Grandma Laney was a rigid, Bible-thumping imbecile. My sweet grandma woke every morning with a kindly smile on her face, but I never once witnessed a grin turn at the corners of old Sook's mouth. Sookie cursed with ease and couldn't string a single sentence together without using the Lord's name in vain. Sook's eyes had heavy lids, and her skin was as wrinkled as a river turtle's. She moved about like the slowest creature. Her pink and blistered scalp was sparsely covered with thin patches of gray and black hair like some molting chicken. Gathered with bobby pins, the remaining wiry strands were pulled back into a tight bun. Her teeth were chipped and coffee-stained, and her puffy face was round and spotted red. A pair of spectacles was roped around her neck on a silver chain and rode low on her nose. She had herself a pair of heavy udders that rested on her bloated belly like 2 sacks of flour, and she spent her days lounging in a raggedy terry cloth housecoat and a pair of soiled green fuzzy bed slippers. Sook had a crop of whiskers, rolled her own ciggies, and used a salad fork to clean crud from under her toenails. My late Grandma Laney's face was as smooth as a porcelain doll's. She laughed with ease, and her complexion was as pale and perfect as a pearl. Soaking wet, my grandma couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds, and her fragile bones pushed through translucent skin. At the dimming of the day, Grandma Laney would sit at her upright piano and serenade me with her favorite hymns. Her pale green eyes were always upturned, focused on the glorious hereafter. Grandma wasn't much for this earth. She knew with certainty she was heaven-bound. "This life is only a resting place," Grandma Laney declared, "before my final march on to glory." The soft-spoken sort, Grandma carefully went fishing for her words, cautious not to make more than a ripple in the water. Only when she was quoting scriptures or sitting at her upright piano did I ever hear her volume rise to over a murmur. But Aunt Sookie entered a room like an angry storm, cussing like the foul-mouthed sailors loitering near the old pirate's house. Aunt Sook spoke directly out of concern and didn't much care if her truth-telling wasn't delivered wrapped in pretty ribbons and bows. Before her passing, my Grandma Laney reminded me, "Poppy, propriety and discretion is the Lord's way. You must always carry yourself like a proper young lady." Grandma was long widowed. My grandpa, Samuel Faulkner, had passed long before I was born. A banker by trade, he'd kept my grandma in silk and satin finery, even though he preferred the green felt of a poker table. Rumor had it Grandma lost her husband to both the guiles of another woman and the seductive lure of the playing cards. When Grandpa lost his position at the bank, he squandered the last of their wealth at the tables. After I was bussed here to Savannah, Aunt Sook declared, "Your Grandma Laney was a fool who gave her money to that worthless, womanizing gambler from Mountain Home. And after Samuel passed on, she gave her heart to every pickpocketing pastor this side of the Mississippi." Sookie's disdain for my grandpa Faulkner burned as hot as a poker. "That man couldn't keep his pecker in his pants," she said. "The very last time I spoke to Laney, she was bawling over the phone. I told my foolish sister the sure way to castrate old Samuel was to kick his secretary square in the jaw." For his final few years on this earth, my grandpa turned to gin for comfort, while Grandma turned to scriptures for her constant companion. As for Aunt Sook, she never seemed to go about hankering for a man. I remember Grandma telling me that her older sister hadn't ever taken her a husband. Sookie had herself a beau in her youth, a sweet young man, about 19 years of age, who pledged his undying love to her. Laney recounted the story. But after he courted that vile creature for nearly 9 months, the sweet boy opted to park his pickup on the tracks of an oncoming freight train. The young fellow lost his life on the tracks that day, but he freed himself from a lifetime of grief living with my hateful older sister. Sookie was no good from the start, Grandma complained. Being the firstborn and all, even our own sweet mama confessed, the first waffle should be made only to heat up the iron and then tossed out in the bin. It seemed that years before I was born, the two stubborn sisters had planted themselves deep on opposite sides of a barbed wire fence. Unforgiveness couldn't take root in such hard, barren soil. Even after the muddy earth had swallowed up my Grandma Laney, Aunt Sook still couldn't find a tender word for her deceased younger sister. I reckon some cuts are so deep that the flesh rots, withers away, and is left to the wind. And so it was that 5 days after my Grandma Laney was buried deep in Arkansas dirt, I packed up my belongings in a single case and was put on a bus to Savannah by a county official in a pinstriped suit. With a safety pin, a smiling fella fastened a tag on my collar with my full name, the date of my birth, and my greyhound's final destination. It was a sweltering August afternoon when Sook came hobbling up to claim me at the bus depot. I stood small in front of her, no taller than maize corn. Extending her quaking hand, she said, "Folks call me Sookie." I replied, Poppy Wainwright." She snickered. "He ain't no bigger than a peanut." "Yes'm, I'm still holding out for a growing spurt." "If you were a fish, I'd toss you back." "Yes'm." "You coming to stay with me for a spell?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good enough," she grumbled. "I reckon I ought to extend my condolences on the passing of your grandma, but can't say I shed a single solitary tear. Your Grandma Laney was a self-righteous nitwit, and if I had the gumption, I'd drive myself up to Mountain Home and spit on her freshly dug grave." I planted my feet firmly on the ground. Balling up my two tiny fists behind my back, I replied, "Well, my Grandma Laney said you're as spiteful as a jackass and meaner than a rabid dog." Sookie eyed me suspiciously from my untied sneakers up to my pigtails. "Is that so?" I gulped. "Yes'm." Sook shrugged her shoulders lightly. "That's true, I suppose." With the tip of her walking stick, she scratched a straight line in the dirt directly in front of my sneakers. "Missy, you're in Georgia now. I ain't got no time for the foolishness of Mountain Home." I cleared a lump lodged deep in my throat. "Ma'am, I'm suspecting my Grandma Laney's conclusions about you were correct." Gripping the handle of my leather satchel, I stepped clean over her line. "Shall we go?" Sook shook her head and mumbled, "Missy, that saucy mouth is going to land you in a heap of trouble." With a wave of her walking stick, we started down toward Digby Street. So, these were the cards I was dealt. My Grandma Laney said to me once, "There ain't no sense going around hoping for aces when the deck is stacked against you with only 6s and 7s."